Welcome to the Who I Became podcast.
Well, on this episode of Who I Became, I'm talking to Mike Scully, and welcome, firstly, Mike.
Thank you, Simon. I appreciate the opportunity to be on. I've really enjoyed this series since it started. I've definitely made a point to catch each one, maybe not on the premiere, but I've really enjoyed the backstory and getting to know a lot of the folks that you've had in the hot seat, so to speak, and getting to know really more about who they became.
Well, Mike, flattery gets you everywhere. So Mr. James McGarvey must have told you I like it. And I said we must start off by saying, you are 1/3 of the church safety guys. So I've now hit all of you for Who I Became. So really excited to be talking to you today. And there's some interesting things in your background that I didn't know before sort of doing research over the last couple of days. But I want to sort of lay a little bit of a foundation about who you are, day job, because quite often in security ministry, which is where you spend a lot of your time, people don't do that full time. There's a day job behind there. So you are a operations and communications strategist for one of the country's largest technology companies. I'll let you determine if you say who that is or not. I kept that out there for you. As I mentioned, you are 1/3 of the church safety guys with James McGarvey and Paul Buckner. You host the largest church safety group on Facebook, and I'm honoured and privileged that you allow me to come on every now and again and try and share what I consider wisdom. I don't know what your listeners say, but that's what I say. And then you were born and raised in Milwaukee, so not too far from where I am here in Minnesota, but you now live in Texas. And I know we're definitely going to cover how the Lord took you to Texas during this conversation. But you've got the two extremes there. You went from Milwaukee growing up to living in Texas. So, we might have to talk about how you actually do that.
Sure. Yeah, it's really interesting, and we do appreciate having you on, Simon, as well. It's always a good conversation, and I think it's a lot of fun, even if my cohorts butcher your name from time to time.
Well, yeah, the name Ozamo, it's not the easiest name to say, so I always give people that. But I love your guys' show. It's all in fun, and the one thing that I really enjoy about not only you three as individuals, but also your show, it is very Christ-led. It is, you consider security in a church to be ministry, and I'm always blessed to be involved in that. But Mike, so thank you for being on. And there's been a couple of big things that have happened in your life that have really sort of shaped your journey. And like I said, with Who I Became, I really like it because there's people that you talk to, or you might see, or just see them on these different podcasts, but you don't really understand the journeys they've gone. And there's been two big events that have shaped your life. And one of them I only found out recently about you in the last couple of weeks. And the first one was that you were diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency as a child. And you're only expected to sort of get to 5'2". Now, I know you're a lot taller than that now. You reach 5'9", but tell us a bit about that chapter in your life, how old you were and how that came about.
Sure, Simon. Well, I was, I want to say about 7 years old, if I recall correctly, and I really had gone through a period of being unusually small for my age compared to all of my peers. And that honestly led to really kind of a season of bullying where other kids would take advantage. And obviously, I think many of us may have at least one experience where something was done to us in school. But this was something that was severe and prolonged to the point where I left the school, and the person who did that bullying today is actually behind bars. Not for that purpose, but ultimately that was there. So the growth hormone was really kind of something where my parents were trying to understand, well, why am I shorter than everybody else, and why am I not growing as fast as anybody else? And in those days, they basically looked at it and kind of charted it and looked at how the growth is continuing. And essentially, they called it by percentiles. And so what they realized is that I essentially almost plateaued. And while everybody else in my age was continuing to kind of grow or follow the curve of their percentile, I kind of started to taper off and ultimately started to drop off in percentile over time. So that led to a series of testing, and that's when they identified it as growth hormone deficiency, which is basically a fancy way of saying that the body is not producing enough traffic signals to tell the body to grow properly, to do what it needs to do to institute growth. And so that was a series of tests and a lot of really a foundational reason why I probably hate hospitals to this day. And while I would be fine confronting lots of different things, still scared of needles. So that's one of those weird things. But from that point, that's really what happened. And so they prescribed a treatment, which at the time was experimental. Prior to that point, anybody who essentially was diagnosed with a similar condition was treated with the basically ground up pieces of ground up pituitary glands from cadavers was what it was prior to this treatment that was then created. So this was the first synthetic treatment that ultimately I was prescribed. We had to fight insurance companies because it led to medical bills that were at the time $600,000 a year. And certainly that was not something that we had to pay at all, but because of insurance. But it required taking them to court in order to get them to cover it because it was outside the normal at that point.
Yeah, and so I mentioned that now you're 5'9", so I guess you're actually same height as me. So it's really good to see that the drugs that you're taking, that experimental drugs at the time, seem to have really worked. And I just want to dive into something that you sort of said there. So this was you around 6 or 7 when this was really discovered, Mike. Okay, so what was that sort of difference between you and your peers? Obviously, you're in a lower percentile, and your friends are growing and getting more advanced. I mean, how much of a difference was there in sort of?
I mean, at the time, when you're talking pre-grade school and kindergarten and things like that, as you're reaching that point, as it started to draw that contrast, it was 6-8 inches shorter. It was smaller for my size. I think part of the diagnosis was ultimately that they determined that my bones were essentially a younger age than I physically was per my birth certificate. So while I was 7 or 8 at the time when they did that test, I still had kind of the bones of a 5-year-old. And so they realized that that's really what kind of was happening, was this delta between the two is how they helped to kind of notice that. But I was the shortest one. So, if you sat there and you're picking kids for the sports ball games, I was last to get picked because I was the smallest kid. Now, that didn't stop me from going on to play football once I got bigger. But at the same point, it still was one of those things that it created an environment of challenge, because every day was through that lens of, well, he's not adequate, he's not good enough, he's not this, he's not that, just because of my size.
Yeah, and it's interesting, in the sense that you use that, he's not adequate, he's not big enough. I'm going to sort of dive in a little bit. How are you feeling at that age when you're either being picked last for sports, or you're seeing your friends, go off and do the things perhaps you want to do, and you're not being included? We'll touch on the bullying in a little bit, but how are you internally processing a lot of this, Mike?
I think as a child, it felt like there was a lot coming at me, and certainly at that age, we really don't have a whole lot of coping mechanisms or resilience built up at that point. And I think that may be part of what the interest in resilience and readiness and training and other sorts of things led to later in life, but certainly the passion for it. But I think it was really not seeing an end or a light at the end of the tunnel. It was, this is my life. This is going to be who I am, what I am doing, what I can be, because I'm limited based on my size. And leading into kind of the picking on and the bullying and so forth, that escalated from basic just banter and childish games into physical attacks and threats and so forth at that point. And that's really where it was really cornering and feeling like I just didn't have a way out.
Yeah, and I know, you'd mentioned that one person that bullied you was sort of, is now in prison. I guess, how do you know that, Mike? How do you know that person's in prison?
So ultimately, after leaving the school, we wrote the board of this was a private Christian school, and we wrote the board. My parents did ultimately to explain what led to our reasons for having to leave the school. And a lot of it was the unwillingness of that administrator really to address the situation. And so part of it was explaining that and kind of doing that. We got to know more about who the person was really at that point. The administrator shared a little bit more about the fatherless home, the different sorts of scenario, which to me honestly just felt like excuses in the day. But with the modern day capability, I didn't forget his name. He certainly left a mark in more ways than one. So it was something where I was able to later in life be able to search for that individual and realize kind of the path that he chose was ultimately led to where he is today.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm hearing, Mike, and I guess what our listeners will be hearing is that you stand in front of me a lot older than that 7-year-old boy, but you've got over it and moved past it, but there's still a piece of you which is back there, and mainly I was going on to the fact that you know who this guy is, and you sort of still research, and so I mean, is that something that you feel that you can let go of? Is that a fair assessment, or is it very
Absolutely? I think that comes in more into who I am today versus where I was. I think only recently God has created that stronger call and challenge to really embrace the forgiveness aspect. And not just to forgive those who kind of have done things against me in life, but really to go beyond that and pray for them. And not just pray for them to stop what they're doing if it's current, but to pray blessing over their life. Because certainly we know that hurt people. And I think at the end of the day, if we really want to have them stop hurting people, we need their life to change, and there's nothing that God cannot do. So if we pray blessings into their life, perhaps that will be enough to have God move supernaturally to cause that change.
Yeah, that transformation, we know transformation has to come from within it, and no matter what it looks like for each individual, everyone reaches it in their own time. So perhaps we hope and we pray for that person, if he's in prison now, that he will be transformed at some point and become a better person.
Amen.
Focusing on you taking this medical drug, and I know that you dubbed yourself the 600,000. It's like the sort of the $1 million man. You're like the $600,000 kid. I mean, I don't know if your parents called you that with all the medical bills. I mean, here in the US, it's still out of pocket, but it's good to be called that. But at what age did you start catching up then? See, when you started taking this medication, and when did you sort of plateau out and become like your sort of peers and friends?
Ultimately, through teenage years, it was still ultimately, I'd say, growth cycle for me was delayed. The treatment essentially, think of it this way, it was acting as the traffic signal in my brain. So the medication was allowing my brain to send the signals it then needed to do to then get out of its own way or do what it needed to do. That's kind of the dumbed down version of it. But doing so, that kind of over time kind of helped get me back to on track with bone age, on track with growth, and stop that plateau or decline in overall percentile of height, and kind of reclimb. So I wouldn't say that I fully felt the difference or acknowledged the difference until towards the end of my treatment, which was into high school.
Yeah, and so we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but, when you look at that period of time from, as much as almost a blessing to actually realize that, there is something wrong with you that can actually be treated, or there's this new medical, source that you can take, but then it sounds like there was a legal battle with the insurance, and, God bless America. I've been here 8 years, but I know the health system here is it's quite messy, to say the least. So let's just leave that conversation there. But there's obviously a long legal battle there. But what do you look back and say? What was the most challenging about that period of your life?
I think honestly, one of the challenges that didn't kind of rear itself in the moment. But I think looking at it was more the impact on others than necessarily directly me. And I say that in the sense that the impact on others is the perception of attention that I was getting. It was all medical, and it was treatment, and it was all this really focus on getting me to be 5'9", getting me out of that 5'2" prediction, which was life-changing really in that sense. But I think the impact on others, and I think there was an impact on siblings in that sense of saying, hey, you know what, Mike's probably getting more attention than we are. Even though in my mind, that wasn't good attention going through it.
Not attention you really wanted.
Exactly. I mean, I appreciate what my parents did. I appreciate what what happened as a result of being on that treatment and kind of suffering through the different layers of treatments and tests and hospitals and things like that, to come out the other side. But again, God had a plan. He moved on that plan and ultimately delivered.
Yeah, now at the time, I guess if you're a youngster and then you sort of moved into high school and you finished sort of a lot of this treatment, were you sort of a faith follower at that point as you sort of turn your life over to God, or were you just sort of learning who He was?
Well, I'd say, I mean, I was raised in the church. My parents have I think one of the best things they ever did for me was model that example of being good Christians, of being a good married couple. Certainly huge shoes to fill on both accounts. And I think that helped kind of project where I wanted to be, to kind of follow in those footsteps. So I think that was definitely part of it. I served from a young age. In many cases, I was in a Catholic church for many, many years, and was one of the first to be an altar server, was one of the youngest to become a Eucharistic minister, and then was one of the youngest to lead music as a cantor in the Catholic Church. So serving was always part of that walk. I was always felt like there was some level of a call to serve, even from a young age, and being part of that church was important. I mean, my parents instilled that, I think, even as an infant. They placed me in my child carrier on the stage of prayer meetings that were ecumenical. And literally, I think I absorbed the worship music as a child, as an infant. And I think that kind of carried through from that point forward. But always part of the church, really always there, certainly not without bumps and bruises at times, or even, I think some people call it sunburn, and feeling of different points. But I found more and more that it was less over my faith and more the lack of faith in other people at times. And it was the burning of relationships and people, not really the faith in God. But the faith in God has really kind of risen and grown throughout my life, I'd say, up to and including, though, before the move to Texas. And I know we'll talk about that, but I think I was probably at a low point. Not certainly at a point where I was saying, who are you, God, or wanting to walk away, but more just, I think, in a point of maybe in the desert, if you will, a period of time where it just felt like, okay, where's this journey going? What's next, Lord? What do you have in store for me? And really not being all in. And God decided to then move in a big way.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, we sort of, we always believe that God doesn't give us more than what we can handle, but some people have more traumatic lives than other, and I guess if we move on to the second sort of significant event in your life is that, you got married in 2011, which is a very happy occasion, but 2 weeks after your marriage, you then found out that you had a brain tumor. So there must have been more emotions. You've taken on something which is so traumatic as a sort of a growth hormone deficiency. You've come through that. You're the same height as me, so you're a tall guy now. And then you get married, but then you have this other challenge. I mean, what were you thinking? Let's start with God first. What were you thinking with God then when you get married, and then you discover you've got this brain tumor? Tell us a bit about that.
I think certainly the the shock of the news. I mean, here's just shortly before that, I'm making vows of marriage, of till death do we part, and facing news of that death could come way sooner than it ever anticipated. And so I think the shock and awe of that component, the realness and rawness of that vow coming possibly true so soon. I don't think many of us who get married think about the vows to that degree. Honestly, I mean, I know we internalize them and many of us write them ourselves, but do we really reach that rawness of, hey, this could happen relatively soon versus years down the line? And I think at that moment, I of course, I couldn't help but wonder, okay, why, God? I'm coming from a high of my life. I've met the woman of my dreams and just married her, and we're just starting our life together. We haven't really even had a honeymoon period, if you will, and facing that reality. So I think there was certainly question, but I'd honestly say I don't think I would have made it through it without that faith. It was that faith. It was surrounding myself with people like my parents network, my church, everybody I knew. I mean, hundreds were praying. There were people praying all over the world for this. And during that time period, from being diagnosed to a few months later, saying that it needed to come out, it needed to go to surgery. That was really what propelled me forward. I felt carried by those prayers in that time period as we continued forward.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I'd like to touch on, Mike, if you don't mind telling a bit of a story as to how you discovered that you had a brain tumor. What did that journey look like?
Sure. So a lot of it was, if I would describe myself at the time as super energetic, always strung well, and really kind of, I'd sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, and that would be fine, and I'd go. I was into a lot of different things, and said I was just motivated and was busy. But what happened is the onset was really fatigue. I started going to needing 8 hours of sleep and still feeling fatigued. And that really is what led to blood tests that determined that, hey, there's more things out of whack, which led to an MRI, which led to them identifying at the time, the growth that then ultimately determined as a tumor, once they were able to look at that all, and then diagnosed in that sense, and saying that, hey, it basically is sizable enough. They thought I would have visual impairment to some degree by that point based on its size, but I did not, praise God. But they did say that, hey, this could continue and could cause major impairment and so forth at that point, so it has to be removed.
Wow. So at that point then, so, they find the tumor, they're clearly inferring, surgery is needed. I mean, they were, it sounds like they were sort of shocked or surprised that you hadn't sort of started to lose your sight. And this is, a few weeks now after you've got married. I mean, have we moved into a month by now, or is this still weeks after you've got married?
Oh, so the surgery ended up, got married in July, diagnosed really in starting in late August into September, and then surgery was in early December.
Yeah, and so, less than 6 months of sort of married life. I mean, as you are, you've had to elect, okay, the surgery is the option that the specialists are telling me, married less than 6 months. What was that 6 months like between you and your wife going into this? Because I know you told me that there was a real percentage, the doctor said to you, that you might not wake up from this surgery. So how did it change your relationship in those sort of 6 months so soon after marriage?
I honestly feel like it was iron sharpens iron. I think we were closer as a result. We were forced to go a lot more serious than jovial. It wasn't just like, hey, let's set up house. It was, hey, this is life. This is what we're facing. We're in this together, and we will march towards it and through it together, and in faith and in prayer and in belief that God will deliver on that surgery. But it was really interesting because the neurosurgeon at that point, I don't know, some may not get the reference, but I would get that many do. If you recall the game Operation with the little buzzer and so forth, many of us probably played that as kids. But the neurosurgeon, so here's top of his craft, he's describing this as, okay, I don't want to scare you, but you have to sign off on this before going into the surgery. So he described it in the sense that if he hit the buzzer, I was either going to be blind because of the optic nerve is right there, because the tumor was touching the optic nerve, or he could nick the carotid artery, which feeds the blood to the brain, and literally would bleed out in seconds. No way to stop that.
As you're about to go, okay, well,
yeah.
Definitely, it makes it real at that point, doesn't it? Like
beyond.
This is like Operation here. If I hit the sides, you're blind. If I do this, you could be dead. It's like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and he ended up being so ultimately it was interesting because he ended up being one of only 7 neurosurgeons in the world certified in that procedure that was necessary. And God being the ultimate choreographer, interestingly enough, that surgeon had practicing privileges 15 minutes from my house. So I didn't have to jump on a plane. I didn't have to fly to another state. I didn't have to figure out how that was all going to be handled. Literally, I happened to be 15 minutes away from one of 7 in the world. And so God had his hand on even that from the beginning. But it was traumatic. And I think it really led to that point when the anesthesiologists were there and they're starting to basically administer and put me under for the surgery. Yeah. It really was a goodbye. I mean, I was forced to tell my wife goodbye because it was a very strong and real possibility that I wasn't waking up. And so regardless, we had no kids at the time. We had nothing really beyond just the two of us. And that realness at that moment is that iron sharpens iron. That was the hardest, I think the hardest moment of my life.
Yeah, and I guess I'm really grateful that you came through that, and again you've come through it as a stronger person. But there must be something, the one thing which is guaranteed is that we're all going to die. We never know the moment or the time. That is God's plan, not ours. But to be, I've had surgeries before for simple things that a snapped Achilles tendon, you got to go under a knife and they're putting you out. But I'm never going under thinking I'm not gonna wake up. Mm-hmm. Everyone feels stressed differently. Everyone looks at life differently. But at that moment, when you're about to go under, how do you really process that? And perhaps you don't. I know you said your goodbyes. Were you just closing your eyes, just thinking, I really hope that I wake up? What does it feel like to have that when the surgeons are saying there is a chance that you might not come back from this?
Yeah, I think, there was, even leading up to that, it was all the different things before even going into the hospital that day. It was getting a glimpse of different things. I literally soaked in a lot of different experiences and views outside in the world, if you will, beforehand. And that last soaking in of that view was my wife, staring into my wife's eyes as I basically fell under. I think that's really what it was. And I think it was more about the then and the now, and not as much as thinking about the what if, praying and believing in confidence that I would wake up, but also in faith, knowing that if I didn't, I knew where I was going.
Yeah, and I want to give a little bit of a joke, and you led me into this, but it's, in England we normally say it's not rocket science, and sometimes say it's, you give them a simple task, it's not brain surgery, just do it. But, I guess you've been through the brain surgery, so I know you gave me that joke, so I wanted to feed it in there to make it a bit lighthearted. But it is, you must have a smile when someone says, hey, come on, can you do this, Mike? It's not brain surgery, just get this done.
I do chuckle every time. It is one of those weird things to be part of that club, to be able to truly understand what brain surgery is, and to be out the other side. I think it's funny in that sense, but also in the way that it opens the door to then share the testimony of how God delivered in that surgery. Because even even in that walking out, or essentially being rolled out, and I heard afterwards, the neurosurgeon told my wife and told my parents that during surgery that the optic nerve was not in sight, and the carotid artery literally moved out of the way, his words. Now, anatomically and medically, those things are not possible. And based on how he described where the tumor was, and it was touching the optic nerve, that's just not possible in this life, okay, without God intervention. So I think God had it happen and choreographed it in the right state at the right time where I could have a surgeon and not fly. He delivered it and made that risk of that operation go down. He guided the surgeon's hands so that he could remove it fully. And then ultimately on the other end, praise God, it ended up being benign and not cancerous. So that pretty much, short of retests and regrowth and checks for MRIs and so forth, that was the end of that journey, but God delivered.
Yeah, I guess let's touch on your faith for a minute. You know, when these two significant events have happened in your life, there are those that either, you know, push their faith away or become challenged, saying, you know, why me? And I know me and you were talking about this sort of offline a little bit earlier. I mean, were there any moments in your life when you were either angry, bitter, or challenged by God, saying, why are these very significant things keep happening to my life?
I wouldn't necessarily classify as angry and bitter. I think questioning for sure. I think points where, yes, why God? Why me? Why now? Why this? I think certainly came into play. But I think there was the ability to be surrounded with others that had stronger faith than even I did helped. And I think those people lifting me up in prayer and lifting the situation up in prayer, and honestly, I think in those situations, having some sort of medical outcome to them, i.e., yeah, I may not get tall, but you may get tall, or yeah, you may not live, or you will live and we'll get it removed and you'll likely be healthy on the other side. So they had some definitive outcomes, which was good there. But I don't think it would be angry. I think definitely questioning. I think definitely more in the sense of saying, I don't understand this right now. I don't understand why I'm in this season. But I think we certainly know I can do all things through God. It strengthens me. And basically, things is not, it really translates to seasons in the older translation. And while I can't personally do all things, okay, as a physical human being, with God, I can do a season. So for me, I went through a season of growth hormone. I went through a season of struggle with facing the possibility of death early on in my marriage. But those were seasons, and God delivered on the other side.
Yeah, and I guess you know, what I take from that is that, you know, what you've learned from that is really that there's going to be struggles, there's going to be tribulations, you know, there's going to be trials, but it's how you cope with those and move forward. I mean, like I said, you've had some very significant things, and the fact you can even share and talk to me about those things today, I think that says an awful lot as to where you are. I mean, it's not uncommon for someone, and that's why I use the words bitter and angry. It's not uncommon for people to say, you know, why me, or, you know, why not that bad person who is stealing from the state and doing these other things. And I'm always fascinated and amazed when people aren't like that. They're very humbled. They're very grateful to be alive. So let's move into a little bit about more about your faith. And the interesting thing, I said this to you earlier, that you used to live in Massachusetts. There was a church in Denver that was doing a multi-site church in Texas, and then that's what caused you to Texas. I was like, how on earth did all this happen, Mike? Did you end up down there? So maybe share with us the plan then as to how that developed, that you moved from one state, from multi-church which was in another state, to then go down to Texas and sort of rebuild your life down there.
Well, it certainly, if you had asked me only weeks prior to God kind of starting us down that path, I would have bet my house against you for moving to Texas. I just didn't see myself moving more than an hour away from a coast. I had either spent that time as a child being close to Lake Michigan, and so that felt like an ocean as a child, of course, or being within an hour of the ocean out in Massachusetts. So I couldn't have seen that coming, and it certainly was not in the plans. We were in the plans to sell our house and try to move into something a little larger, but we really had plans to kind of move down the road a little bit, if you will. Massachusetts was still the plan, either building or buying. And that was really what we wanted to do. But God used YouTube, believe it or not, and all of us in social media and using that heavily today. God used a YouTube video of the Denver church, Red Rocks worship, basically their worship team, and put that in front of us. And it was the first time we'd ever heard them. Now, that's rare, because my wife and I listen to a lot of different praise and worship music pretty regularly, and she was playing playing this in the other room for the kids and on our Apple TV, and I was in the other room working from home. And so normally she'd just hit click and skip the commercial. But I picked up on the first few bars in the other room. She picked up on it while she was in the other room and didn't hit skip. And I'm like, "What's that?" And she goes, it's a group called Red Rocks Worship. I said, "Okay, never heard of them." So I walked into the other room, decided to listen and watch for the 7-minute song, which was their ad, and just felt stirred. It stirred in a real way, where God showed up in that moment, in that song, in that YouTube video, in an ad, no less, and just felt stirred. And we kind of searched and saw, okay, they're in Denver, Colorado. Okay, that's probably why we haven't heard of them. And that was part of it. But they said, basically, then we saw coming 2019, Austin. It didn't say Austin, Texas, so we immediately thought, is there an Austin, Colorado? Because they're like, okay, they already have multiple campuses in the Denver area, so we figured for sure it's just another campus out there. But something just resonated with us with Austin at that moment, and it's hard to explain other than a stirring, if you will. And we started really kind of praying about it and kind of saying, what is this, God? And really just discerning. And over time, it became numerous things where doors were closing and doors were opening, and it just made more and more sense, kind of pointing on a I almost liken it to a runway, where the plane's coming in for a one way and the lights are flashing to show the pilot where to land. That's kind of what I felt God did for a long period of time, and it just dumbfounded us for a while. But every time he did something else, and I mean, there's at least 50 little things that I could tick off throughout that time period. But we listed our house. We got an interested buyer. We put a deposit down on a house in Texas, and that was made possible because I worked for a company that happened to be based in Texas. And ultimately, I was able to be on a business trip, search for a house, put a deposit on it, all paid for during the company trip, basically. So I didn't have to spend any additional monies to go out of my way to search for a house, and did that. But then kind of really went all in. So we were all in, said, okay, God, this is what you have for us. We're listening. We don't know how or why, or this feels really weird. But at the same point, we kind of decided that, hey, we're all in. And what's interesting is that at that point is my company that I was working for decided to put up some dollars to assist with the relocation.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, out of the blue, here's some money, basically, and let's help you move across the country. And so that helped obviously immensely to listening. So it's easier to listen when some of the finances were much easier to stomach at that point. But really, we kind of had gotten to a point in that journey, and this is almost over the course of 6-8 months as we're trying to sell our house. And we reached a point where we had kind of backed down to the lowest number with the buyer. We had placed a deposit down here in Texas, and we got our inspection on our house, and it came back to the buyer, and the buyer comes back and wanted $9,000, and we were all in. We had spent every last piece. We had backed down to our last dollar that we had budgeted to still be able to get the house that we had put a deposit on. And so we're struggling through that weekend, thinking we're going to lose the house. So this was a moment of weakness, a moment of doubt, a moment of faith dropping to our feet, if you will, and where we should have been dropping to our knees. And I think at that point is we did pray, but what was interesting is the message at Red Rocks that morning in Denver that we streamed was of Jesus in the boat during the storm when the disciples doubted Jesus and his capability and got scared. Yeah. And later on that afternoon, after hearing that sermon and restoring our faith that God, you can move and you can make this happen, because after all, we're doing what you told us to do, God. So we need you to move in a big way here. We put $2,000 more into it, which was basically going to be our furniture fund. Yeah. It was going to be how we were going to get new furniture in the new house. And we said $2,000 is all we had left. And we thought it was going to fall apart still, but we're praying over it. Lord, bless this. And the buyer came back from the $9,000 demand and accepted the $2,000. And we marched towards closing on that house.
Yeah, and the amazing thing about Story, I've got a lot, being English is certainly natural. I've got a lot of viewers in Europe that listen to this, and I want to get it into perspective that we're not just saying move 60 miles down the road here. We're talking about different states. What is the actual miles between your old house and where you live now? Do you know?
I don't recall the exact. I want to say it's over 2,000, but. Yeah,
if you go from the southern point of England to the northern, you're most probably in the sea by then, So it is perspective. And I know that one of the things that we were spoken about was, that really sort of you had a stirring to get you into security ministry. That there was, you'd volunteered and you'd helped in other areas before, but you didn't really feel at home until you got in church security. So maybe just sort of finish up by telling us a little bit about the church safety guys and what you guys do now.
Sure. So
got to give a free plug because I'm always on your podcast. So, it's only fair that I give you the opportunity here.
Appreciate that. Well, I'd say, it's different things. I was an elected official in my community. It allowed me to then get involved in emergency management, initially as a representative, and then more actively, I became deputy director of our community emergency response team. It allowed me to work with teams of volunteers in preparedness and emergency response. I got to fly the town's drone and so forth, and do different things. But I think that's where it got me into a lot of different trainings and preparedness. From a safety perspective, it's how I got CPR certified. It's how I got AED and first aid and a lot of different trainings with the police and fire and EMS throughout that. Even though I wasn't a sworn officer, even though I wasn't on the fire department, I was afforded the chance to be part of a lot of training that I otherwise wouldn't have had an opportunity to do so. And I think it really always struck me as the need for that in churches. And this was more than 10 years ago at this point, but really the need that churches had to protect the sheep. And I know that metaphor is used a lot, but at the same point of saying there needs to be protection, not just physically in a place of worship, but in the sense that even our right to worship itself and worship freely, it needs to be protected. And I think there was always this inclination of saying, all right, stand guard, of place watch and watchman on the wall, and being out there and saying, what can I do to help keep people safe, or what can I do to help prepare them? And so I was doing that in my community, and so it made sense to also then bring that those years of service in the church forward and combine all of that together in the safety ministry perspective. So serving across a few different churches, doing just that, and now doing that for this church plant, Red Rocks Austin, as helping train their team, helping instill what's necessary for procedure, helping do risk assessments of a brand new building that we only got 2 weeks in our new building before COVID hit, and then all of a sudden we're out. So there's still things I'm chomping at the bit to implement because of plans in this new building, but really just that sense of service, but feeling like, God really kind of said all along, here's the challenge, here's your ability to be resilient, here's how I can deliver. You're willing to listen, I'm willing to bless you, but I'm also going to equip you. And I know many we've heard in the industry, and it's said, I think Carl has said, and others, God equips the called. And I really feel that those opportunities, that training, the ability to be in those teams in different churches and preparing me for serving in a church plant, for serving in a safety ministry, was not just the emergency training. It was the heart of worship. It was the heart of ministry. It was the heart of prayer and faith in God and his ability to move. Because you know what, at the end of the day, we can train till we're blue in the face, but if God is not on our side, I don't want to be David against Goliath.
Yeah, and actually, it's an interesting point that you say there. I think it's God doesn't call the equipped; He equips the called. And I do consulting with your house of worship on safety and security, and quite often I say, you don't need a guy like me, because when I walk away, you need the structure behind. And there's a lot of people that have a lot of skills and experience, but safety and security in a church is just so different than any other environment. You need people like you that work in IT during the day to have the passion and the aptitude, and God will give you those skills. So before we wrap up, then Mike, give us a plug for the Church Safety Guys. How can people find out more and listen to your Facebook Live show?
Sure. So we're a nonprofit dedicated to houses of worship and church safety and security. We have our largest group on one of the largest on Facebook is Church Safety and Security.
I always say the largest.
You know what? I'm a little bit humble there, but it's one of the largest anyway. But I think really focused on both at that sense. But you can go to churchsafetyguys.com and certainly find out more about us. But the big thing that we do is a weekly broadcast on Sunday nights, where we're bringing in people like Simon and experts and subject matter experts and leaders in the church security and safety world that share a little bit of insights on different topics, and we try to unpack that in a way that is a little bit more realistic. It's not just what my colleague Paul Buckner likes to say is not just tactical, it's practical, and we try to unpack things in a fun way. And you've been on the show there, Simon, so you know kind of the style where we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we do understand that, look, at the end of the day, church safety is first a ministry, and second, it's the ability to train, because we need to be able to reach people's hearts, not just be able to stop them if there's something physically involved. And while we'll continually train and we'll train and we'll train, we have to also make sure that our mind is prepared as well. So Church Safety Guys has a couple of different devotionals available on Amazon. You can also find them on our website, but it's specific to church safety teams. Fire, EMS, and police departments really as well could benefit from these devotionals. But for me, I'm the newest of the three. I joined only this year, but again, really feel part of that calling that God kind of led me this direction, and the ability to, again, continue to give back and to have an impact, not just on the church I'm immediately serving, but to help others across the country and the globe, really, for that matter. We get reached out to all the time with questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with people, to share our perspectives. Are we always 100% right? Absolutely not. We're learning every single day. And we've experienced a lot, but there's more that we haven't experienced. But at the end of the day, we're willing to help, and we're willing to get people pointed in the right direction, and in hopes that churches across the country will embrace the idea of church safety, even if they don't go full-fledged security and the whole armed thing. That's fine. It's about safety first. It's about that ministry minded first. And so I'm very blessed to be part of the Church Safety Guys.
And Mike, that was a good plug and a long plug. And I tell you, I've got to know you so much better, because normally when I come on that show, all the talking is done by James and Paul. So this interview has really allowed me to get to know you better. So it's been an honor and a privilege to hear your journey and allow you to share your journey. So, I'd encourage the listeners to go and check out the Church Safety Guys on Facebook, and then your Sunday Night Live show. And I just want to remind people, for those that are listening to the podcast, you can get us on Apple, Spotify, all the big platforms. And if you want to see the video interview of me and Mike, you can see that on the YouTube channel at Simon Osmo, or on the Facebook page, Who I Became. So Mike Scully of the Church Safety Guys, I've now interviewed all of you until you get any new members. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast. If you are enjoying the discussions between Simon and his guests, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review, as well as share with your friends on social media. Once again, thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast.